Welcome to this ASP.NET Core Identity in-depth course in .NET 10. Since this course was originally published, there have been over 12,000 students with more than 1,800 ratings. The average rating currently is 4.5.
In the first section, we're going to look under the hood of ASP.NET Core Authentication and Authorization without using identity, so that we can have a complete understanding of how ASP.NET Core Identity works and what are the purpose of those objects that we're going to use in ASP.NET Core Identity and what are the purposes and how they achieve what they achieve. So this is really the under the hood section. We're going to learn about security in general, right? And then authentication and authorization flows. We're going to learn about what are identities, what are principals, right? What is security context. And then we're going to start implement a login page. We're going to generate cookies to sustain and remember who the user is, right? Remember those identities. And then we're going to read the security context from the cookie. And then we're going to learn about how authorization works in ASP.NET Core. And we're going to create policies with claims. We're going to also implement a custom policy-based authorization scenario, which we can use to cover complicated cases. So after we understand how exactly authentication and authorization works in ASP.NET Core for web applications, in the second section, we are moving on to securing web APIs. Web APIs, instead of using cookie, typically we use tokens. So in this section, we're going to learn about JWT tokens. We're going to implement the JWT token authentication, and we're going to learn how to encapsulate claims in JWT token. We're going to implement the whole JWT token authentication and authorization flows. And then we are going to also implement authorizations with JWT tokens. In the third section, this is when we really get into ASP.NET Core Identity, but with the complete understanding of how ASP.NET Core Authentication Authorization works. It's very easy to understand how ASP.NET Core Identity works, right? We're going to learn about the essential parts of the identities. We're going to learn about what problem identity actually resolves. What's the knowledge that we have learned so far? And then we're going to configure ASP.NET Core Identity, and we started code with ASP.NET Core Identity to cover typical scenarios like user registration, user login, email confirmation, signing in, signing out, collecting user information. We're going to learn about roles, as well as we're going to create user profile pages and be able to update user information. And then in the fourth section, we're going to learn about MFA with ASP.NET Core Identity. So MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. Right, we're going to learn about how it works, and then we're going to start implementing with email multi-factor authentications, and then moving on to Authenticator app multi-factor authentication. And finally, last but not least, we're going to learn about external authentication providers. I'm going to use Facebook as an example. We're going to learn about how OAuth works in general, because multi-factor authentication usually depends on OAuth. Right? And then we're going to create a Facebook application, and then we're going to link our web application to Facebook, and we're going to start implementing the delegation to Facebook so that we can complete our course. This course is definitely not just a theory course. It contains a lot of practice, a lot of coding. By the end of the course, you will be able to understand how exactly ASP.NET Core Identity works, what problem it resolves, and you will be able to use every single part of ASP.NET Core Identity to secure your web applications, to secure your web APIs. Please feel free to look into the course and watch all of those free preview videos. I'm very excited to see you in my course. In this video, we're going to learn about security on a high level so that you have a very solid understanding of what security really is. What are the key concepts in security, including security context, authentication, and authorization. Let's imagine this is a military base, right? There's a security guard, and this is you trying to get into the yard. So you go here, and the security guard will ask you to show your identity, right? You cannot just say who I am. The person will not believe you. So you have to show your identity card that will actually make sense to the security guard, right? Every person have many different type of identities. You can have your driver's license, you can have a student card, you can have an employee card. But in this case, you may have to show your identities that is provided to you by the military base or by the military units, right? So once verified that your identity information is valid, basically verify that you are who you say you are, then most likely the security guard will give you a access card. Right? So let's use this as an example. Let's say this is access card. So you will have a access card in your hand. So let's combine this together, right? So you now have a access card. And this access card contains, again, your identity informations, as well as some of the other information may be including expiry date, right? So you may only have access to this military base for a limited period of time. Now, if you want to go into any of the buildings, you cannot just walk in and we'll check your internal identity card, this card that was given to you, to verify that you have the permission to go into each one of these buildings, right? Because each different building may have different requirements. You have to be perhaps above a certain rank, or you have to be one of the managers of this building. Then it will allow you to go in. And when the card expires, you would have to go out of this facility, right? You have to return your card. So within this process, we have three concepts here. So the first process here is that when the security guard verifies your identity and give you an internal access card, this is a process of authentication, right? To verify that you are who you say you are, and then provide you with this internal access card. And this internal access card is what we call the security context, right? The security context that contains all of the information about you, so that when you carry this security context to any of these buildings, it will then apply certain requirements to your security context, right? Verify that your security context contains enough permissions to satisfy the requirements to enter the building. And this process is called authorization, right? Authorization is the process of verifying that your identities are satisfying the requirements of entering or accessing the building. And similarly, in a web application, imagine these are the different pages, and you have this login page here that is trying to, like the security guard is asking you to log in, right? The process of logging in, which is providing the username and password and verify the username and password, that is called authentication. And authentication also provides you the security context, right? If it's cookie authentication, then it generates the cookie. And if it's token authentication, then it generates the token. So you have either the cookie or the token or something else that contains your security context. And then the subsequent requests go into the page, different pages will carry the security context, either cookie or token, until that security context expires. And then it will lose your access to the entire web application. And when you access each one of these pages, each page may have different requirements, and that's the authorization comes in, right? The authorization process will look at your security context and then applies those requirements toward that security context to see whether your security context actually satisfies the requirements of accessing the page. If it does, then it will allow you to access the page. If not, then it will return HTTP 403 error to indicate that although you have logged in, but you don't have access to this page, And if you cannot even log in, then we'll actually return HTTP 401 saying you're not authenticated. In the previous video, I covered a little bit about security in web application. In this video, I want to cover still on high level, but I want to provide a little bit more detail in terms of the flow. If we have a user here trying to access a web page, right? Let's imagine this login page is already loaded because the user wants to access some information that requires login, right? So the user would interact with this browser to enter the credentials, right? So once the credential is entered, a HTTP request is sent to the server, right? So let's use this arrow to represent the HTTP request that is sent to the server. When the server receives the credentials from the HTTP request body, it's going to then verify against a user store to make sure the credentials are correct. Why do I draw a database symbol here? That's because the user information is stored usually in the data store, right? So the credentials need to be verified against the user's data store. So this step will happen, and if the verification is completed correctly, that means the credentials are correct. The identity will come back. The identity information will be used to generate the security context. So let's use this rectangle to represent this verification process. Verify credentials. And then we're going to use this second rectangle to represent the process of generating the security context. So after the verification, the identities will be pulled into the web server and store those identities in the security context and then serialize that into a cookie. If you're not very familiar with the concept of cookie, I just want to add a little bit information here. A cookie can be considered as a piece of information that is stored in the header of the HTTP request and HTTP response, right? That information is going to be carried back and forth between the browser and the web server. And there is a feature with this piece of information because in the header you can contain lots of information, but the cookie is a special type of information because it can only be shared within the same domain, right? You cannot send a request to a different web server that carries the same cookie because there is a security problem. All right, let's go back to this authentication and authorization flow. So let's imagine this is a normal cookie authentication, which is very suitable for this web application, right? So then this serialized cookie will be containing the HTTP response and then will be returned back to the browser. The browser will then redirect the user to a different page, and including that redirection, every single subsequent HTTP request will contain that cookie, right? So let's use another arrow to represent one of the subsequent requests, and then rectangle will represent the authentication process. So you may ask why this is authentication where this is already the verification process is already authentication, right? So yes, this whole part here, both of these rectangles are part of authentication, right? To verify the user is who they say they are, and then generate the security context, serialize that into a cookie, sends that back to the browser. So this is all authentication process. Why do we have this authentication process again? Here, we have it in the cookie. We have the security context in the cookie. The web server will have to deserialize that into the security context, and then the web server will actually know whether the user is actually logged in or not. So this part of deserializing the security context from the cookie is also part of authentication, right? So basically, in one statement, authentication is a process to know who you are. So because the security context is already stored in the cookie, so in order to know at this step, in order to know who you are It only needs to decrypt that cookie and deserialize that cookie because the cookie is encrypted. So once those happens, immediately we know whether the user is authenticated or not. So this is still the authentication process where we decrypt the cookie, we deserialize the cookie to get the security context. And then once we have the security context, which is actually contained in the HTTP context object, right? Once we have that information, then we can tell whether the user is authorized to access the information or the page it wants to see, right? So that's the second step, which is authorization, right? So authorization will happen right afterwards. And then if everything is okay, then the web server will decide to return the proper response that contains and all of the data that the user requires. From this video, I wanted to show you that both these steps as well as these are part of authentication, and then the authorization process is relatively simpler from at least conceptual level. In this video, I want to quickly cover the basics of .NET Core, including the middleware pipeline and the filter pipeline. I would expect you have experiences with ASP.NET Core already, but I still want to quickly cover the basics just in case you need a recap. So .NET Core is a platform for creating web applications that includes web APIs as well. So web applications are based on HTTP request. Right, so you would have your front end and your back end, right? So you have your front end browser and your back end server. The front end browser and the back end server is sending HTTP request back and forth, right? So the request contains a lot of information, right? It can contain information in the URL, can contain information in the HTTP header, as well as body and other places. The request and response basically just contains pieces of information that needs to be passed back and forth between the front end and the back end, right? The browser and the server. So let's zoom into the server, right? So let's imagine this part is the server, and because we want to zoom in, we want to make it bigger. Inside this server, we have a place where we need to process the request, right? You can have one function, for example, to process the request right here, right? Just process. And then the request is processed, the response is generated and sent back to the server. And the user will see the HTML, right? So that's okay, but the process itself has many steps, right? Like authentication, authorization, exception handlings, logging, routing, and validations. All those steps need to be performed. Right? If you couple everything together, that go against a lot of software design and architecture rules, principles. So in order to process this in a proper way, we can apply some software design patterns. And one of the software design patterns is, this is the chain of responsibilities. So then we would have many functions instead of one function. We can have many functions here. Right? Let's say, just call it function 1, function 3, and function n. So all of these can be connected together. So what this connection means is that this message will be handed to the function, for the first function, and the first function will process it, do something to that message, right? Mutate that message, and then pass that message to the second one, to process the message and change that message, and then pass on to the last one, and then return that message back, still process it afterwards, still process it and pass it all the way, and then generate the final HTTP response and send that back to the browser. And by the way, the message that I'm referring to is the HTTP context object that encapsulate both the HTTP request and the HTTP response. So this is what we call the middleware pipeline, right? This middleware pipeline kind of separates, that's the separation of concerns. Each middleware in the pipeline takes different responsibility. Right? Usually the last one that are responsible to process the business logic here has its own pipeline, because these are for cross-cutting concerns like exception handlings, logins, right? Authentication, authorization, partially authorization. And then here, according to each different request, we process them differently, and therefore we should have another pipeline that will, according to the different requests, will process it differently, right? The second pipeline here are not handling cross-cutting concerns, but handling specific concerns for the specific request. So you would have different filters here instead of different middlewares there, right? So these functions are basically middlewares, right? So here then you would have filter 1, filter 2. I'm not writing it anymore. Filter 3, for example. So your request, your message will be also going through all of these. So here I want to emphasize this may not go in one by one. It may go through the first one and then go around, and then going back may not go through each one of them. It may go around. Whereas in middleware, it will go like that. But anyway, the filter pipeline has many filters connected together, and these are for handling specific requests, whereas these are for handling cross-cutting concerns. So this is the basics of ASP.NET Core, right? And once I go into coding, very quickly in the next few videos, I will share coding, and these concepts are important to know before that. Another very important concept to understand before I actually start coding and show you how security identity actually works within ASP.NET Core is this security context. Right? So what is actually the security context? The security context contains all the information that the user has for security purpose. That includes the user information itself, username, and all of the other type of user information like email addresses. Those items are actually encapsulated within one single object that is called claims principle. In ASP.NET Core, we're using claims principle. So that's why I mentioned claims principle, but it's actually, we can say that on a conceptual level, we have a principal object that represents this security context of the user. It's basically, you can consider this is the user, right? And the principal contains one or many identities of the user. Why there can be many type of identities? I think I have explained in the first video that one person can have many type of identities, right? You can, for example, you can be a student and you have a student card. You can be an employee and you have your employee card. And you can have your driver's license, and you can have the access card to your apartment building. So all of these are a form of identity. The next level is claims. One identity then can contain many claims. Okay? What are claims? Claims are basically a key value pair that carries your information. For example, this identity is your driver's license identity, right? Driver's license. And you can see that on driver's license, there is your name, for example, my name. And then you may have your birthday, whatever your birthday is. And then you could have your height, whether you need to wear glasses while you're driving. Driver's license also contains my eye color and as well as my address. Right? So all of these are claims. These are just examples of claims. Of course, one claim is just one key pair, right? So if you want driver's license to contain all of these, then it would be like this, right? So these are the relationship between principals, identities, and claims. Again, the principal represents the logged in user. It has all of the information that the logged in user has. And then the principal can have many identities. Usually we have just one identity, which is the default identity. And then one identity can have many claims, which carries all of the user information. And then eventually when we're doing authorization, we can use these claims. We can apply those requirements on each page or resource in our web server, right? Those requirements that requires certain claims to be present in order to gain access to the resource. Okay, let's jump into Visual Studio and start digging deep into ASP.NET Core security. So I'm using Visual Studio. Let's take a look at the version. I'm using preview version of Visual Studio Community Edition. And if you go to command and prompt, and if we type in .NET list the case, and we can see that we have the .NET 10 Preview 4 installed. So with this Preview 4, I'm going to be able to create web applications with .NET 10. If we don't have this, then you can go over here and just type in ASP.NET Core, and then you can see we have the first one. For you, it may not be the first one, but most likely will be the first one. This is the Razor Pages application. So this is actually considered as the primary web application under ASP.NET Core. So let's work with ASP.NET Core Razor Pages application for understanding ASP.NET Core identity. So let's click on the next button and let's call the solution. First of all, actually, I want to select a different folder. Not sure whether I have temp folder or not yet. So let's go under here and I'm going to just create a new folder over here, temp, and select the folder. Now the solution name, I'm going to call it web_security. And for the project name, I'm going to call it web app _ under the hood. So this project is for us to understand how exactly ASP.NET Core works under the hood. Okay, so let's continue. Let's click on next button and we're going to select .NET 10 preview and we're going to keep the authentication type as none because we want to understand exactly how ASP.NET Core identity works under the hood. We don't want to take any template that comes with already configured authentication and authorization. So let's click on the create button right here. And now we're looking at this screen and let's close this. So this is an intermediate course. I'm not going to go about and explain how everything works together. I expect you to understand the basics of ASP.NET Core web application. I'm going to come to this diagram and we'll follow this diagram back and forth along these lines so that we can investigate each and every single step. So first of all, we don't have a login page, right? But we do have other pages where we're going to send requests and receive a response. So let's examine this part first, because this part carries all of our security context. So this is the first part we're going to examine. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go under the pages folder and then let's take a look at the index file. So this is the home page of our application. This page currently is not protected. Therefore, we should be able to run it without any problems. So let's actually run in debug right now. All right, this page is loaded. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Visual Studio and I'm going to set a breakpoint right here. And then we're going to go back to the page and I'm going to refresh the page. Here, the breakpoint is triggered. And I'm going to go to the watch window over here and add something to look at. I'm going to examine the information under the page model of the Razor pages, which contains the data construct for Razor pages, which is pretty similar to MVC data construct. And if we come over here and say base dot, and here is all of the information under the page models, and one of them is user. So if we go user, and then we open it up, and you can see that this user itself, actually redo it into user, and if we hover the mouse over this, you can see this says this is the principal, right? And it's called claims principal, which is the security context that I talked about in the previous video. So the security context here is called user because it's a user principal. We need to take a look at what is under this. You can see that the principal contains a list of identities, which currently have only one. And this one identity is basically this identity outside. And this is the primary identity. In the first video, when I talk about when you go into the military facility as a person, you have many type of identities. You have your driver's license, you can have your employee card, you can have your student card, you can have everything. You can even have a library card. But the primary identity in this example, when we talk about the military facility, right, it's supposed to be the one that is provided to you by the military. So this identity is our primary identity in our ASP.NET Core application. So let's go over here and let's just type in dot identity so that we can examine the identity itself. Let's open up identity and then see it has different informations here. The main information is the claims, which currently it doesn't have anything. And the reason is that the current identity is a anonymous identity because the user hasn't logged in yet. Here, this is authenticated member here is false, right? So this means that we logged in yet. We don't have the actual user information here. But what I want you to pay attention is that whether you have logged in or not, once the HTTP request goes into ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core creates a primary identity for you, which is right here, regardless whether you have logged in or not. And if you logged in, then it will contain all of your security context. Your security context is the user object, and this is your primary identity. But if you haven't logged in, then you will still have your security context. You will still have your primary identity. But in this case, this is a anonymous identity. We'll call it anonymous identity, which is still a security context. It's just anonymous. So this is the concept I'd like you to understand, that regardless whether you logged in or not, you have a security context. You have a primary identity. Since in the last video, we have learned about the anonymous identity inside the HTTP context object. In this video, we're going to create a login page so that we can have an actual login identity instead of anonymous one. So let's jump into Visual Studio and continue from what we have created from the previous video. So this is Razor Pages application. Therefore, you see this Pages folder. And let's right click on the Pages folder and create a subfolder. Let's call it Account. And under the Account folder, we're going to create a login page. So let's right click on it, click on Add a Razor page, and we're going to select Empty Razor page. And we don't want to scuffle the login page because we want to learn everything from the scratch so that we know everything under the hood. Now let's click on Add. We are going to name it as Login and click on Add again. Okay, this Razor page is created. You can see that it has a front and a back. It's based on MVC, but it gives you a MVVM view. And it's also sort of like the traditional ASP.NET, where you have a page and a page behind. One of the first things we need to do is to create a model. And in here, we are going to call it credential. We haven't defined the credential class yet, but that's fine. We can start writing it, and it's going to be a public property. So now let's define this credentials model. Right underneath here, it's temporary. I know it's not a good architecture, but let's do it temporarily here so that we can focus our energy on understanding identity. So we're going to say public class, and class name is credential. We need the username and the password. So Visual Studio suggested me this, and you can see it also suggests me to assign an empty value. So let's accept that. And we're going to do the second one, which is going to be the password. So password, also going to modify this to username. And here, we're also going to assign this empty value. This is because Nullable is enabled by default in the project file since .NET 6. If I don't assign the empty value here, then you're going to see this squiggly line, and it's going to tell you non-nullable property password must contain a non-null value when exiting the constructor. Because of that, you either use a question mark to acknowledge that you are aware that the password field can be null, or you are assigned an initial value. So in this case, we're going to assign an initial value because we are always going to have a value for the username and the password. And you can see we have a similar problem here. By having this green squiggly line, we are reminded by Visual Studio that we need to initialize this field. So we're going to initialize it right here in line. And another thing we we can do about this property is to use the bind property attribute. And this bind property attribute will help us to use the credential property here to communicate between the razor page over here and the page model class right over here. And before we go ahead and create a markup of the login form, let's use some data annotation here to help us with form validations. So first of all, the username and the password fields are required field. Secondly, we can use the display attribute to specify that the username should be displayed as user space name instead of user name without the space. And the password, we can use data type to say that this is a password. Now we are ready to go to the razor page and work on creating the markup. Okay, first of all, let's go to the shared folder over here. You can see that in the layout, we have a reference to the Bootstrap by default from the Visual Studio template for the razor pages application. Right? So by default, we can use Bootstrap classes. So let's use some Bootstrap classes over here. I'm going to create a container. So div, and the class name is container. And we want to have some border for the container. You don't have to have border for the container. It's just that I prefer to have a border. I think it looks better. And then I'm going to add some padding over here. So padding 20 pixels. And now I have a container. So within the container, I'm going to create a form. As you can see that in this version of Visual Studio, it's going to suggest you create a lot of code based on AI suggestions. So in order to show you exactly what I'm trying to do, sometimes I may accept these ones, sometimes I may not. So in this case, I'm gonna just manually type in the form. So and then I'm gonna explain to you what exactly what I'm doing here. So the method of the form is gonna be post, so that we can post the credentials from the browser back to the page model of the login page. So we have a form here, and then we are going to create a row. So I'm going to say div and class, and then I'm going to have a row for form, and I want to have a margin bottom, okay, so that in between two different rows here, I have a space. So I can choose 3, or you can use whatever number you feel like, and then you can test it out. So I have a row, and then within the row, I'm going to have 2 columns. One is a narrow column. So to do that, I'm going to say column -2, and the other one is going to be a wider column. And because of that, I'm going to say column -5. The one that is narrower, I'm going to put in a label. So I'm going to say label, and then I'm going to use tag helper to point out to which field this label is going to be bound to. Here I can access the credential property of the page model, because we are referencing the page model from right here. I can say that the label is bound to credential.username. And then in the wider column here, I have an input field. So I'm going to say input, and then I can say the type is text. And using the tag helper, I can say that this field is going to be bound to the same thing, credential.user. Okay, and the class I'm going to use is form control. Okay, and now I'm going to copy this and make another row. And this time, this is the other field, which is password. And I'm going to change this one to password as well. And of course, this type of the input field is going to be password, so that as the user is typing, the password won't be just clear text. Okay, let's give it a try. All right, the application is running now. And in order to actually take a look at our login page, let's actually for now go to Visual Studio and let's go to Solution Explorer. So you can see that we have a pages folder, and then we have account folder, and then our login page is situated inside the account page. This is the Razor application, and as you may know, for Razor Pages application, there's no routing attribute, because by default, the routing is based on folder structures. So in order to go to our login page, all we have to do is to do /account/login. And then we can see our login page. And this looks pretty good, except that we have this username right here. It's not actually displaying user space name. So there's something wrong inside here. So let's go back to the page model over here, and we define this credential, and the display, well, this is not description, it has to be display name. And let's give it a try again. And now you can see the problem is fixed. After that, we will need to add a submit button. So we're going to copy this field here, and we're going to delete the actual field. We can keep the second column empty. So let's delete this. And then we can delete this label and put the input button here. So it's going to be a submit button. Submit. And the class is button, but it's a primary button. So we can use the btn primary class over here. And the caption on the button is login. And I'm going to refresh the application. And now you can see our login button over here. So now if I click on the button, you can see the page is refreshed. So there is actually a submission. All of the fields data is postback, although they're all empty. Well, this is not what we want. We want to have a validation because the user has to enter the username and password. And for that, let's go back to Visual Studio. With ASP.NET Core, this is a pretty simple task. At the very top of the form, you can add another div, and the class would be text ginger, and we're going to use the app ASP validation summary tag helper. And here we can use either all or mode only. It doesn't really matter. And then over here, into the second column, we can add a span. And the class here is also text ginger because we want to display error messages. And tag helper is ASP validation for. The field is, of course, username. So this is going to help us display error messages that is related to the username field. And we're going to do the same thing for the second field, which is password. So with this, I'm going to rerun the application, and then we'll see whether our validation messages are being displayed or not. We can see that our validation is working and our error messages are being displayed properly. So I can rerun this. And now if I enter a username and a password, let's say username is admin, password is password, and I click on the login button, you can see that the data is posted back and then the page is refreshed. But how do I receive this data? Let's go to the page model over here, and you can see we have onGet. By convention, we also have something that is called onPost. Okay, and this onPost is like an event handler that receives the HTTP request, which is HTTP post request, and process that request. So let's run debug. Again, let's go to account login page and username, password. Now you can see the breakpoint is hit. And if I go to the watch window over here and type in this dot credential, and let's expand this, you can see that username is admin, password is password. The form data is actually posted. Now that we can access the form data that is posted back inside onPost method, the next step is to verify the credential and then generate the security context. We're going to do that in the next video. I'll see you in the next one. Now that we have implemented a login page and we have also covered where the security context is stored, we're ready to implement the verifications of credentials as well as generating the security context. So let's jump into Visual Studio and start implementing those logic. So first of all, we need to make sure that we do have our credentials. And for that, we'll need to check our model state to see whether it's valid or not. And if it's not valid, we are going to return. And then next, we want to verify the credentials. And we are not going to connect to the database. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the security aspect of that. So that's why we're just hard-coding the verification process here. So I want to make sure that username is admin and the password is password. So as long as we have these two match the username and password, then we're okay. The next step, okay, so here we verify the credential, right? And then the second step here, we are creating the security context, right? And if we go back to our diagram that we drew before, we will need to create a bunch of claims, and then we'll add to the identity. We only need one identity, which is the primary identity. Once we have the primary identity, we add it to the claims principal, and we are done with creating the security context, right? So for that, we'll instantiate a list of claims. I'm doing Control Dot to import the namespace here. And then of course, we are going to add, let's add some claims here. Right, so we're gonna have a name, and let's call it just admin, and perhaps we'll add another one. We'll add another claim, and let's see what options do we have here. Do we have an email? Yeah, we have an email. Let's say admin at mywebsite.com. Right, that's good enough. Now that we have the claims, you know, we have mentioned the claims are just a pair of attributes, right? And with that, we need to add those claims to a identity. So now we need to declare and instantiate the identity. And what we need is a claims identity, which we can add the claims to it. And then here, what we want to have is the authentication type. The authentication type. Let's give it a name, and then I'm going to talk about this later, right? So we're going to use cookie authentication, which is the typical type of authentication for a login page, right? Let's call it my cookie, like my cookie authentication, right? And you can give it whatever name you want. So once we have the identity, then what we need is a claims principal. I mean, to instantiate that, and it can be empty, but you can also provide a primary identity. You can also provide this primary identity here. So now we have this security context within the claims principal, right? We have learned that the principal contains the security context. Now, what we need to do, we can see that we generate the security context, but then next step is we need to encrypt and serialize the security context, and then it can go into the cookie, right? But we don't need to do that ourselves. We can use the HTTP context object. It has a sign in async method here, which is an extension method. You can see it's an extension method. It comes from the ASP.NET Core HTTP namespace. Right, so we can do that. And here, we also want to specify the authentication scheme, which is the authentication type. And we want this authentication type to be exactly the same as this one, right? And then here we can provide the principal as the second parameter, right? So we're going to put in the claims principal here. Since this is async, right? So we need to await it. And because of that, what we need to do is we'll change this to a task, and it has to be an async task. And because of that, we'll also make this one async. So this one is supposed to, what it does is that it's going to serialize the claims principal into a string, and then encrypt that string, save that as a cookie in the HTTP context, right, into the cookie inside HTTP context object. And if everything is good, then we're going to redirect to a page. So let's just redirect to the index page, right? You can see that this redirect to a page, it actually returns the redirect to page result. So because of that, we are going to, instead of making this a void, we're going to make it return iAction result, Of course, here, what we can do here, we have to fix it. We can return the page result here. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to basically return the view, right? So this one is going to find the index view and return the index view, right? When we return the page result, we're returning the login.cs HTML, right? Which is the CS HTML object. And if the verification failed, then it will fall out of this branch. And again, we're going to return a page, okay? So let's build this solution and then let's run it, right? So because we did not configure authorization, that's why it did not redirect us to the login page directly, but we can go to the login page, right? And then we can type in the password. And if I type in something that is wrong, so it will return directly back to the login page, which is this one, right? But if I input the correct password, then watch what happens. It throws exception. So let's look into this exception. See, it says that no sign-in authentication handlers are registered. Did you forget to call the @authentication @cookie? It tells you exactly what you need to do here. But before we actually do this, let's try to understand what is actually happening here. Right? It says that on this line, there's something is wrong. So what exactly is wrong here? Right? Let's read this error message again. It says there's no sign-in authentication handlers. Authentication handlers. So this is the keyword, authentication handlers. Right? So what is actually happening is that this HTTP context sign-in async, under the hood, it uses the authentication handler, which is provided to this through the iAuthentication service interface. Okay, so let's take a look at the iAuthentication service interface. See, this interface contains the abstraction of several methods, right? There is this sign-in async, which is exactly the one that we're missing, right? It contains sign out, challenge, forbid, and authenticate. So these are the abstractions of the authentication handlers, right? So what is complaining here is that the HTTP context.sign-in async is trying to use the iAuthentication service interface, but it cannot find any concrete implementation of that interface. So we are missing, we don't have the handlers here. And it asks you to inject, right? So this is the dependency injection under the configure services, right? It asks you to inject the implementation of those handlers. Let's take a step back and see what is actually happening here as from the design pattern point of view. Right, so let's see this. Let's use this printf in the C language, for example. Right, usually this printf will print to the console, to your screen. So this is the output. The printf will output to the console. But if you use different libraries, it can go to the console. Right, it can also go to, let's say, a printer. Right, it can go to any other I/O devices. What is actually happening under the hood is that the printf is not talking to these devices directly. What it's actually talking to is an abstraction of the I/O devices. In C++, this would be an abstract class. So these drivers implement the abstraction. And then as long as you import the libraries of the corresponding drivers, then you are able to print to console or printer or other devices, right? So what this printf is really talking to is this abstraction. So this kind of design pattern, this kind of design pattern is basically it's everywhere. It's typically when you have some I/O devices. You don't want to lock your library to a particular output device. Right? You don't want to, for example, you don't want to lock your output to just SQL Server database, right, by locking to a specific SQL Server database library, you want to talk to an interface and then develop all of these as plugins. So in our case, it's the same situation here. We are having a bunch of authentication and authorization. In this case, we're talking about authentication, right? We're having some requirements for authentication, and it needs to serialize the information, right? The security context to either a cookie or a token or something else. They are kind of like a IO thing. It's outside the application boundary. It's under the HTTP protocol, right? So the security context can be stored or can be serialized to either a cookie or a token or something else. You don't want to lock yourself to just a cookie or just a token like this, right? You don't want to directly talk to it. So what you actually want to do is you want to do a similar thing, right? So inside your application, right? So let's use this this square or rectangle as a boundary for your application. Inside it, you want to talk to a abstraction, right? And this is the authentication service. This interface in C#, it contains the abstraction of all of your needs for authentication, right? So your actual authentication will just talk to this abstraction, and then the cookies or tokens, the different authentication handlers, as long as it implements this authentication service, then the only thing as a developer what you need to do is to tell the ASP.NET Core that either you want a cookie authentication handler to be injected, or a token authentication handler to be injected, or both, right? Or both. And that's where the authentication scheme name or the authentication type name come into play, right? That name comes into play because it can be this or this, right? Cookie or token or both. Because there can be multiple authentication handlers that implements the authentication service, we want to give them different names so that we can distinguish, right? ASP.NET Core can distinguish which is which. We can use the name to group the cookie, the security context, which is the principal entities, and the authentication handler itself together. And that's why we need to specify the name everywhere. And what is that name? That is the authentication scheme or the authentication type, which you have seen when I was implementing it. So let's jump into Visual Studio and see how we implement these, right? And it's actually very clear here. It's actually telling you, you need to add authentication. You need to do this. So let's copy this and let's stop debugging and let's go to our program.cs file So the way to configure our services is right here. This is where we can add services to the services container, or sometimes we call it the service collection right here. And we can do it above this line or below this line. So let's do it below this line this time. This is a place where we want to inject our authentication handler here. What we want to do is I'm going to just paste it over here, and I'm going to copy the builder.services and paste it over here. I'm going to add a dot here. So you can see that we're trying to add authentication to our services collection here. And here, add cookie is to add the cookie authentication handler. This default cookie authentication handler is implemented by Microsoft. It handles the serialization of the security context. It handles the encryption of the serialized result into a cookie. We don't have to worry about implementing the encryption or description or serialization, deserialization of the security context. We just need to add the cookie authentication handler. And all we have to really take care of is just to give it a correct name. And over here, let's look at the second parameter. Second parameter here is options. We can use the options to configure the behavior of our authentication handler. And as you can see, there's so many different things we can configure, and we're going to cover them in the near future. Right now, we just want to configure the cookie name so that the cookie name equals my cookie auth. So I'm going to say options.cookie.name equals myCookieAuth. By providing the name, the authentication handler knows which cookie is going to serialize the security context into. And it also knows which cookie contains the security context when verifying the credentials. So therefore, we only need to configure the cookie name for now, and we have to be very careful that this name and also this authentication scheme name, as well as this authentication type and this authentication scheme name, they're all the same. So we can actually use a constant instead of just hardcode these strings. I'm not going to do that now, but in your own project, you actually have to use constant in case that you're going to have a typo or something like that. By having the same name, they are logically grouped together and it will all work together. So let's save the solution and run again.
I'm going to bring up the developer tool, right? By pressing F12. And then I'm going to go to, right, clicking on this double arrow, and then I go to applications. I want to look at the cookies, right? So go under cookies, right? Open this up, and then go into this domain, right? Cookies are always associated with specific domains. So we're looking at this domain, so that's why we have to go under this domain. And we can see that we don't have myCookieAuth, the cookie name. We only have this by default. We have this anti-forgery a cookie here, right? So we don't have our cookie yet, but let's watch what's happening here. So let's go into provide the correct username and password, and then let's watch whether we're gonna have a cookie or not. All right. So you can see that we have a cookie. Right? We have our cookie, so this is all encrypted, right, and serialized. So this contains our security context, which is the claims principle. But we can't see anything because it's really encrypted within this domain. And where does the cookie come from? That comes from here. So this HTTP context.sign async is triggered, and it talks to the authentication service interface. And who has implemented that interface?
That is in the program.cs. We have the cookie authentication handler injected into the service collection. And we specify the name here.
So that when we trigger this method, it uses the cookie authentication handler that we have injected into ASP.NET Core, taking this name. And finally, we can see that claims principal security context is created over here, taking the cookie name. Okay, so let's recap. What we have done today is we input username and password. We implemented this verification process, and we implemented the generating process, right? We generate the security context within the claims principle. We injected the authentication, the cookie authentication handlers, right? And we successfully created the cookie. So the cookie is now sent back to the browser. We saw that in the browser developer tool. So in the next video, we are going to follow this line to see whether we have the cookie deserialized and decrypted. I'll see you in the next one. So in the previous video, we verified the credential here, and then we generated the security context. We serialized the security context into a cookie and send that cookie back to the browser, right? We could see the cookie in the browser developer tool, and it looks like this. It is encrypted. In this video, let's follow this arrow to look into what this authentication does and how it does it.
So we're gonna run our application in debug mode, and let's go to /account/login, and let's try to input the correct username and password. Click on login. And now let's open up our developer tool, and let's go to applications. Go to cookie, and we can see myCookieAuth. This is the cookie that we generated from the login page. And you can see it's encrypted right here, which means that the cookie is already generated. And if I go to the home page right now, if I click on this again, the cookie in the browser is going to be definitely sent to the server. So let's actually set a breakpoint on the index page, which is the home page, right? I'm going to set breakpoint right here, and then I'm going to refresh this. Now I'm going to come over here and say this.user or base.user, doesn't really matter. And let's open it up. And now you can see that we have identity is authenticated equals to true. And we have in the identities collection here, we have one identity, which is the primary identity. Right? And if we open up the primary identity, we can see is authenticated equals to true. And we have the two claims that is created. One is for the name and the other one is for, I believe it's for the email. So let's take a look at the types. So email address, right? Email address is right here. In the previous versions of ASP.NET Core, the behavior is slightly different. By default, if we don't do anything, just like this, the is authenticated is going to be actually false. And you will have to do two things specifically in order to make your server application interpret the incoming cookie. The first one is to add the authentication middleware explicitly. The second one is to specify the default authentication scheme here. Because as you can see, let me actually put this in the next line and then put indentation. Well, we only added one authentication scheme, and you can actually chain this with multiple different authentication schemes. Previously, even if you only have one authentication scheme, you will have to specify the default authentication scheme name here, right? So for example, you can say, actually the first parameter here is the default scheme name. So in the previous versions of ASP.NET Core, I think before .NET 9, you have to specify the default scheme name. This either this way, or you can say options.default scheme name, then you specify the name. But I think after .NET 9, you don't actually have to specify this because you only have one scheme installed, right? Only when you only have one scheme configured, then the default authentication scheme is that only one. Also, you don't have to specify this authentication middleware because you already specified authentication, right? You wanted to include authentication, you added a authentication handler, and you have map razor pages to map to endpoints. Then ASP.NET Core will implicitly include the authentication middleware. But according to Microsoft documentation, they still suggest you to explicitly add the authentication middleware. So we're going to do that. We specifically specify that we're going to add the authentication middleware. And this authentication middleware is going to look into the HTTP context. It's going to check whether there is a cookie or not. And then it's going to use the specify the default scheme, which is this one, in order to interpret the cookie. That's the proper way to configure the behavior of interpretation of the cookie. Personally, I think that out of the two things, this is definitely the must. You definitely want to explicitly specify the authentication middleware here. But over here, if you only have just one authentication scheme, you don't have to specify this, right, default scheme, because it's obvious that the default scheme that you're going to use is the one that you configure right here. But in order to be super clear, I'm going to explicitly specify the default scheme in this course, and I'm going to specifically specify the authentication middleware. So now to make you understand more clearly about the job of the authentication middleware, let's jump into this diagram here.
We know that along these lines, the request actually is within the HTTP context. So there's got to be a middleware who's going to look into the HTTP header within the HTTP context and then populate the security context with the corresponding values. So, and that middleware is our authentication middleware, right? So when the authentication middleware is looking at the HTTP request within the HTTP context, it should be able to see the header that contains the cookie, and then it will interpret that cookie And after the processing, it will populate the security context, right? The claims principal with the values translated from the cookie. So that's the job for the authentication middleware to do.
And in order to add the authentication middleware into our ASP.NET Core middleware pipeline, we just need to say use authentication. And this needs to be added after the routing middleware and before the authorization middleware. And the responsibility of the authentication middleware is to use the authentication handler in order to interpret the security context within the HTTP request.
Look at our authentication service interface. We can see that this authenticate async, right? We can see this is the one, right? So authenticate for the specific authentication. So this one is going to be called, and this method is going to be called and is supposed to be able to translate all of the cookie into the security context.
All the configuration that this authentication middleware required is already configured over here. And because we specified the cookie authentication handler, then it's going to be able to interpret the cookie within the HTTP request. It knows the scheme name and it knows the name of the cookie. Then it's able to interpret that cookie, decrypt it and deserialize it. And it will be able to know the security context within the cookie. Okay, we talked a lot. It seems that this is pretty complicated, but there's only just a couple of things you need to remember. First one, you need to use the authentication middleware in order to deal with the security context within the cookie. Secondly, you need to configure how the authentication middleware should work. And especially here, you need to add the cookie authentication middleware in order to interpret the cookie within the HTTP context. And of course, you need to specify the authentication scheme name, right? The scheme name is basically a logical grouping of everything that is related to your security context. And that's everything you need to do in order to authenticate. We'll continue from the next video. In the previous video, we have covered the authentication here, which the authentication handler is used to decrypt and deserialize the cookie so that the server is aware of who has logged in. In this video, we are going to cover the next step, which is authorization. But first of all, let's learn about how authorization works in the ASP.NET Core. So if you have a browser here and you input a URL in the browser and you want to access a certain endpoint or a certain page on the server. So let's say we have page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. Different pages may have different requirements for accessing the page, right? For example, page 1 could be allowing anonymous users to access, whereas page 2 could be a admin-only page. And maybe page 3 will only allow people from the HR department. And page 4 may be looking at, you have to be a admin, and also you have to from the HR department, right? It's a combination of these two. And maybe you have page 5 where you have for example, a casino, online casino page where you have to be older than 18 years old, right? So there's all different kinds of requirements on different pages or different endpoints we're talking about web API. So these requirements have to be satisfied in order for the user to access these pages, right? We know that when a request is sent to ASP.NET Core server, it goes through a pipeline. After it goes through the authentication middleware, we know the security context, which contains the identity of the user, and identity contains a set of claims, right? And it's going to tell us whether the user is an admin user, which department the user comes from, what is the age of the user. So all of the information are contained in the claims. And of course, before the authentication middleware comes in, this routing middleware that tell us which endpoint it's trying to navigate to. And then the authentication middleware will be able to
deserialize the cookie into our security context, the claims principals, identities, as well as claims, right? Then at this point, we know, for example, we're trying to hit page 2. Who's going to check the requirement? That's the authorization middleware. Okay, so the authorization middleware is the middleware that will look at the claims from the user and then look at the requirements from the page and then compare them and make sure that the claims satisfy the requirement. And if that's the case, then it will allow the user to access the page. Otherwise, it will return HTTP 403, right, which is a challenge, right? You don't have the permission to access the page, although you're logged in. So that's how authorization works on higher level. But the question is, what are those requirements? In ASP.NET Core, we actually have requirement classes, and then we can group different requirements together, form a policy. So we would have a policy, and one policy can have one or many requirements. Let's use 2, for example. So we can define these policies in the configure services method within the startup.cs file, which I'll show you later. Right, we can define these policies, and then we can apply these policies by using the authorize attribute on the appropriate pages, which I'll also demonstrate later in the next video. In this video, I just want to give you an overview of the architecture of how authorization works. Right? So we can define a policy which contains a bunch of requirements. So these requirements are pretty simple. The presence of the admin claim is there, then we're okay, right? If the department claim has a HR value, then we allow the user to access page 3, right? And this is basically a simple combination of 2 claims. As long as they're there, then we allow access to it. But then it comes to this, there is a comparison. How does the authorization middleware be able to handle this type of requirement checking? Well, we have to create custom requirement ourselves, and we have to implement the logic of handling those requirements. As a matter of fact, in ASP.NET Core, for each requirement, there has to be a corresponding authorization handler to handle those requirements, right? So basically, the authorization middleware uses something that is called Authorization service, just like the authentication middleware uses the Authentication service, right? And then the implementation of the authorization service will look through all of the requirements, right, and find corresponding handlers to handle each requirement. Actually, each requirement must have a corresponding handler. For checking the presence of the claims, there's generic ones to do the job. But if you come up with a particular requirement that needs particular logic, then you have to implement your own requirement. Let's say requirement 1 is contains a specific logic. You have to implement that authentication handler yourself by creating a class and derive that class from authorization handler to handle this requirement, right? So in this case, the policy is applied to a certain page, right, which contains a custom requirement, requirement 1, and then we have a requirement 1 authorization handler to check the requirement, and then the authorization service will be invoked by the authorization middleware, and this completes the authorization requirement checking. Once it's complete, it's going to either grant you the access to the page or deny you from accessing the page. Just to recap, after writing an authorization, we know which endpoint we're trying to hit, like which page we're trying to hit, and we have all of the claims, and then the authorization middleware will be able to check what is the requirement. It uses authorization service requirement handler in order to check whether the logged in user satisfies the requirement for this endpoint. Because it has the identity of the login user, it has all of the claims of the user, then the authorization handler will be able to look at the claims and the requirement and then compare them and implement any type of logic that it needs to, right? The generic authorization handler is enough to handle those simple scenarios where you just say, I want this user to be admin, right? There's no logic, just checking the presence of the claim or checking the value of the claim of a certain claim. So those ones can be handled by generic authorization handler. But for specific ones with specific logics, you can implement a handler yourself. And this is the whole flow and the architecture of authorization. I hope it helps. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. If not, I'll see you in the next video where we're going to implement authorization. In this video, we're going to learn about how to implement authorization in ASP.NET Core. So we have gone through this diagram in the previous video, and we know that the first step we need to do is to apply a requirement. The simplest requirement we can apply to a page is to deny anonymous users. And to do that is very simple.
Let's use the index page, which is the home page, as an example. So above the page model, we're going to add the authorized attribute. And then we're going to import the namespace, which is Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authorization namespace. So this authorized attribute works with the authorization middleware, which simply denies the anonymous identity when you use it like this without any other parameters. Okay, let's save the page and let's run the application and give it a try. Now you can see immediately I was kicked to the login page because the home page requires the user to log in, but it finds the anonymous identity. Hence, it kicks the user to the login page. But how does it know where the login page is? The default location in ASP.NET Core is /account/login. And because we happen to have it, so let's go to Solution Explorer over here. We happen to have it at the /account/login because we created the login page at the exact location. Therefore, we are able to access the page right here on the screen. But if we were to change, let's say we change the name of the folder. Let's rename the folder to account 1, for example. And then if we go to the page and let's try to access the home page again and hit enter. Now, and in order to test that, let's actually close the browser and also close the application and rerun this. Okay, in order to have the folder structure take in effect. Now you can see immediately it still tries to go to /account/login, but it couldn't find the web page at this location. Therefore, it gives the HTTP error 404. Now, what if you really want to put the login page at a different location, or you want to call the login page differently? Then you can go to program.cs to actually configure it. Let's go to program.cs right here, and the settings actually inside the authentication handler here, and you can go options login. It already knows what I'm trying to do, so you can specify it like this, but this is the default location, right? And in our case, we added 1 in the folder name. So if I set it like this, then it's going to work. So let's actually close this and run the application again. Now you can see that it takes me to /account1/login, and I'm able to access this login page again. Let's revert it back because we don't want this location. I just want to use the default location, and let's change the folder name back to account. Now let's run again and enter the correct credential. I guess I have to close the application and try to do it again, otherwise it wouldn't pick up the change. Okay, so now on the other screen, I have it accessing the correct path /account/login. And now let's enter the correct username and password. And now I'm redirected to the home page here, right? I'm able to access it. That's because I already got the authentication ticket, which is inside the cookie. Let's open up developer tool, you can see that we have this my cookie auth and the information is inside it. And when I try to access the home page, the authorization middleware sees the authorized attribute. It also sees that I do have the correct authentication ticket, therefore it grants me access to the home page. Now let's delete the cookie because we don't have a logout page yet, so let's manually delete the cookie. And then if I refresh this page, you can see that I'm kicked out. Another thing I want to show you is that I mentioned that the authorization attribute here works with the authorization middleware, but I didn't demonstrate that to you. So let's go to program.cs. This is where we plug in the authorization middleware. So if we have this comment out, right, and then even if I enter the correct username and password, it wouldn't be able to authorize anymore. So let's give it a try again, and let's go to the login page, enter the correct username and password, and click on login. Now it throws exception. So what does this say here? Let's enlarge the font size. You can see it says invalid operation. The endpoint contains the authorization metadata, right? So what is this referring to? This refers to the authorized attribute here, right? It contains the authorization metadata, but a middleware was not found to support that functionality, right? So it asks you to configure the application startup by adding the app.useAuthorizations in the application startup code. If there are calls to the app.routing or app.use endpoints, the call to the app.useAuthorizations must go between them. So it gives you very detailed explanation and telling you that you need to use this method to plug in the authorization middleware. It also tells you where exactly you need to do it. Let's go back over here and revert the code. All right. And now let's run it again. With the authorization middleware plugged in, you can see immediately I'm able to access the home page. Why is that? Because the cookie, which contains the authentication ticket, is already generated previously. It's just the authorization middleware was missing. Therefore, it wasn't able to use the information within the authentication ticket to tell whether the user has access to the page or not, and hence exception. Now, since we add the authorization middleware back, we're able to access the page again. Now let's delete the cookie again and prepare for the next scenario. Okay, so the previous scenario was very simple. It was simply denying anonymous identity. Now let's make it a little bit more complicated. What if our requirement is that we require a claim to have a certain value, right? So we're requiring a certain key value pair. To support that scenario, let's go to Solution Explorer and let's add Human Resource Razor page here. So go under the Pages folder and then add a new Razor page, and let's select the empty page and let's call it Human Resource. Right, click on Add. Then we have a new Razor page added right here. Let's go to just the index page and copy, not everything, but copy this part. And then let's go over here and add it here. We don't need the learn about, we just need the title. And in the welcome, we can change it to Welcome to Human Resource Department. For this page, we only want to have the people who belong to the Human Resource Department to be able to access this page. So in order to do that, we need to configure the policy. And we go to program.cs file. And so what is that policy? That policy is related to the authorization middleware. So we need to configure the authorization middleware now. So just after we configure the authentication middleware, we can say builder.services.add authorization. Okay, so this is how we configure the authorization middleware. And we can say options goes to, and we need to add policy here. So we can give it a name of the policy, and we can call it, we just want to make it very clear, very intuitive, so we say must belong to HR department, and then we say policy goes to, so this is where we actually configure the policy, and we can just say the policy actually requires a claim. So let's minimize the Solution Explorer, Okay, I require the claim to have a certain value. And what is that claim? I require the department claim to be HR. And let's close with a semicolon right here. So basically what I did is that I added a policy to the authorization middleware. And that policy is called must belong to HR department. And the details of that policy, the detailed requirement of that policy is basically that it requires the department claim to be there and the value of that claim has to be HR. Okay, so this is where we configure and this is how we configure. Now let's go to the HR department page, right? The human resource department page. Let's go to the backend here, right? The page model. And again, we're going to use the authorized attribute, but we're going to use it slightly differently. Now here, you can see that it can be used as a method, and policy, which is a string, is one of the parameters here. So we can say policy equals to, and then we specify the name of that requirement. So let's go back to program, and I'm going to just copy this and paste it right here. So this basically tells the ASP.NET Core framework to say that, hey, authorization middleware, look at my requirement here. My requirement is the must belong to HR department requirement. And then when the authorization middleware sees the name of the policy, it's going to go into the configuration and see how this policy works. And it will look at this required claim method. It knows how it works. It's going to examine the department claim and see whether its value is HR or not. If the claim is not there, then the user is rejected. If the claim is there, but the value of the claim is not HR, then the user is also rejected. Now, right now, if we go to our login page, under the account folder, so this is where we generate the claims, right? And then we group the claims to identity, and we'll put the identity to the principal, which is the security context. Right now, we only have 2 claims. So we don't have that department claim. Therefore, if we try to access the human resource department page, we expect ourselves to be rejected. Okay, let's run the application and see whether that's true or not and how it looks like. Okay, so let's go to our page over here and let me make it a little bit bigger. Make this side a little bit smaller here, and this is too big. Let's roll back to 100%, and I'm gonna just log in properly. Okay, click on login button. Now I'm gonna just save it, otherwise it's gonna remind me every single time. Now we have a cookie, right? This cookie is going to contain only those 2 claims, which means we don't have access to the human resource department page. I'm gonna call it human resource. I'm gonna hit enter over here. Now you see this error, right? It gives this 404 not found. That's because it's looking for this page. This is the /account/access denied page. So the actual error behind the scene is HTTP 403 challenge, right? The challenge status code is returned when the user is actually logged in, which means the authentication ticket is present, but the user doesn't have enough permission to access the resource. In this case, HTTP 403 is returned, and the authorization middleware automatically redirect the user to the /account/access denied page. But in this case, because we haven't created this page yet, it gives the HTTP 404. Right, so again, this is similar to the /account/login page. This is the default access denied page. Right, this is the default page that corresponds to the HTTP 403. Now, if you do want to change the default location, again, you can still do that inside the program file. Let's go over here, and then let's go to here, and we can say options.access denied. You can see this is the default one, right? And if you want to change it to something else, you can just modify it here. In our case, we want to use the default one. And let's actually create the default access page here. So /account/access denied. So let's create a new Razor page. I'm going to use the empty Razor page now, and this is called access denied. Hopefully I can spell it correctly. Access denied. And let's just provide very simple HTML here. I'm going to just use and this is access denied, and we need to provide a line break here and just provide what is the thing it generates. You do not have permission to access this resource. All right, so this is pretty good, and let's give it a try now. Run the application again, and let's bring up F12 developer tool. You can see that we already have the authentication ticket, which does not contain the claim. And let's try again. Let's go to human resource, and now I'm redirected to access denied page, which is the page that we just created. Then how do we gain access to it? We just need to add the proper claim with the proper value. So let's go to the login page and imagine that the admin user is supposed to actually have the claim, right? Then we can add the claim here. So claim, and then we add the department claim, and we set the value to be HR, right? So let's run the application again, and then let's go over here. Now, this cookie, we need to be careful here. This cookie still contains the previous value, which means that if I try to, let's go to home page again, and then try to go to human resource again, I'm still having this access denied problem, right? Because the cookie is still the previous cookie. So let's actually delete the cookie, and then let's go to the home page and click on login with the correct user and password. Now, if I go to human resource, you can see that I can see the human resource department page because I already have the correct claim with the correct value. So what we tried in this scenario is to have this policy that requires a certain claim to have a certain value. There's a actually even simpler approach, which is to add a policy that requires the presence of the claim. So it doesn't really matter what the value of the claim is, as long as the claim is present, then we grant the user access to the certain resource. So let's try that scenario. Let's say that we are going to create a settings page and only admins can access this page. Okay, so let's go under pages and let's create another page and let's call it settings. And again, we're going to add the title to this page and we can use the human resource. Let's go over here and copy this and let's go to settings, put it over here. And let's say this just called settings. And let's go to the page model over here. And we're going to add the authorized attribute. And the policy is going to be called admin only. All right, we don't have the policy yet, but we can write it. Now let's go to program.cs to try to create that policy. Now let's add the policy in here. It doesn't really matter you add before the existing policy or after existing policy. It's just that the admin policy may come first in your mind at least, right? So options.add policy, and we give it a name first. We're going to call it admin only. So this is going to match the settings that you put over here, right? Because this is the name, the first parameter. And then we use lambda expression to configure the actual policy here. And we're going to say policy.require claim. But in this case, you can see that it has the first signature here, which is just the claim type, which is the name of the claim or the key of the claim, right? And the previous version that we used here, I believe that's the second signature. So if we go take a look at this, it's the second signature. But this is actually, you can actually enter an array of this, a list of this. But in our case, I want to demonstrate that we only require the presence of a certain claim here. And here I'm going to call this the main claim, the admin claim to be here. And then we finish this line with a semicolon. Now we go to login page where we create the claim. I'm the admin, right? So I'm supposed to have the admin policy. So I'm going to get right over here and let me actually delete this comment and I'm going to create a new claim. And this claim, I'm going to just call it admin. And the value can be anything because we're really not checking the value of the claim in the policy, right? It can be anything. But in this case, I want to set true. So logically it makes sense. Now let's run the application And remember that we already have a cookie, but this cookie was the previous cookie, so it doesn't include the current claim, the new claim. So I'm going to delete it, go back to home page, and log in again. When I log in as admin, now I'm going to have the new admin claim. And then if I go to /settings, I'm able to access the settings page. So far, we have been having very simple policies, right? We are only requiring a claim, either a claim to be present or a claim to have a certain value. So what if we have a slightly more complicated scenario where we require multiple claims to be there and there's a relationship between them, right? So in this case, let's demonstrate with another page, and I'm going to create this page, enter the pages folder, and I'm going to call it HR Manager, and then click on Add. And again, we're going to go to the human resource page, copy this thing, come back to HR Manager page, paste it over here, and I'm going to just call it Welcome to Human Resource Management. Now I'm going to go to the page mode over here and add the authorized attribute. And the policy, I'm going to set it with a different name. I'm going to call it HR Manager. Now let's go to program.cs to configure it. Okay, so HR Manager only, it means that first of all, the user has to belong to the HR department. Okay. Secondly, the user has to be a manager. So let's configure that type of policy. Let's use options again and add the policy. And the name of that policy is going to be matching the one that we used there. HR Manager only. And then I'm going to delete this and recreate it myself. Okay, so I'm going to put the policy right here, policy. And then I am going to actually delete these two. I delete everything, okay? And then I'm going to say dot. So I'm going to say dot, which is related to this policy. So dot require claim. So I'm going to require the department claim to be there because this user, whether it's a manager or not, has to be part of the HR department, right? And then I'm going to chain it again with another required claim. I'm going to say you also need to be a manager, but I don't require the value. I only require the present of the manager claim. So this and another required claim, when you chain them together, it becomes the AND relationship, which means that this HR Manager only policy requires this and this. Now let's finish this with the bracket and a semicolon. Now let's run the application. And of course, we're going to have access denied. Let's go to HR Manager, and you can see go to access denied page. Now let's delete the cookie and let's go to login page where we generate the claims. Now the user right now, which is the admin user, already has the department claim and the value is HR. We just need to make sure this admin user also has the manager claim, and you can set it to true, which logically makes sense. But this value can be anything because we're not requiring the value of the claim here in the program.cs. We only require the presence of the manager claim. Okay, now if we log in again, the new authentication ticket is going to be generated with this new claim in it. In fact, all of these claims in it. And then it's going to work. Okay, so let's click on this, go to the home page and click on login. Now this cookie is generated with the new claim. And let's go to /HR Manager. And now you can see I'm able to access the Human Resource Management page. So we demonstrated all these three different scenarios with simple authorization policies. Let's go to program.cs, right? So we demonstrated a simple policy that requires the presence of a certain claim. We demonstrated the policy that requires certain value of a certain claim. And we also demonstrated a combination of both with the AND relationship, which you can do it this way. We have seen this cookie a lot. Every time we want to simulate logging out, we have to manually delete the cookie. So before we go any further, let's actually implement the logout functionality so that the cookie can be automatically deleted. Let's go into Visual Studio. If we go to our login page, you can see that we have this sign in async, which is used to create the cookie and use the cookie to wrap around the security contact. For deleting the cookie, similar to sign in async, we have a sign out async. So we are going to use that to implement the logout functionality. We will need a logout page, and inside the logout page, we're going to use the http context.signoutAsync. So let's go ahead and add a logout page. We're going to add the logout page under the account folder, and I'm going to add a empty Blazor page, and let's call it logout. For this page, we don't actually need any HTML markup. We just need to implement the functionality in the page model class here. And we don't even need a onGet method. We just need to implement the onPostAsync because we are going to use signoutAsync method. So therefore here, I'm going to use async task. And because we're going to use a redirect to page, therefore we need to have a return type. And here, we're going to use http context and sign out async here. And you can see that this method takes the scheme name. So we will need to make sure we specify the correct scheme name. So we can go to the login page, copy this. By providing the scheme name, ASP.NET Core knows which cookie to kill. Therefore, it's very important to have this scheme name spelled correctly. The best practice is to create a constant, but I'm not going to do it in the course. But I highly suggest you to create a constant so that you don't have a problem with typo. Here, this is the async method. We're going to use await. And then we're going to redirect to a page instead of action. So action is for MVC. Redirect to page is for Blazor pages. And we're going to redirect to the indexed page, which is the home page. So now that we implement this somewhere, we have to trigger this method. For that, we will add a login or logout button over here. This is the place where we want to display a logout button. When user clicks on the logout button, we have to trigger this onPostAsync method. And for that, let's start with creating a partial view. That partial view will wrap around the markup for the login and logout button, depending on the status, whether the user is authenticated or not. For adding a partial view, I'm just going to copy this partial view and paste it over here. Then I'm going to change the name to underscore login status partial. And of course, inside here, we don't need these scripts. We need some logic here. So we're going to say if user is authenticated, in this case, we're going to display a welcome message along with a logout button. Otherwise, we're going to display a login button. So that is going to be an anchor and looks like a button, right? But it's a link button. When the user clicks on that link, we go to which page. So this is the tag helper. Help us to navigate to the login page. And the caption is login. Over here, the green squiggly line is basically just saying that the user could be null. So we can say if the user is not null, so we can use it not null. And at the same time, if the user.identity, which is the primary identity, if the primary identity is not now other, and at the same time, if the identity that is authenticated is true, then we're going to create a form. So we're going to create the form, and the method of the form is post. Right? The reason why the method of the form is a post because we created the logout page. And in the logout page, we have a onPost method, and that's going to react to this post. So inside the form, first of all, let's give it a little bit style here. So the form is going to be a inline form, and we're going to use tag helper. We're going to say this form is going to be posted to the /account/
logout. So this particular page is going to receive the post action of this form here. So inside the form, first of all, we're going to have a welcome message here. I'm going to say welcome at user. So this is the principal dot identity dot name. And then I'm going to have a button. So the type of the button is going to be submit. And the class is, first of all, going to have a margin on the left. Okay. We don't want to have no space between the button and the welcome message. Secondly, this is going to be a link button. So I'm going to say btn-link, and the caption is going to be just log out. All right, we completed our partial view, and we're going to use this partial view inside the layout page. So in the layout file, go to the bottom. We are going to add it over here, and we create a div. And I'm going to add a margin right because we want to align that to the right. And I'm going to say partial name is login status partial. Again, this is a tag helper to help us to render a partial view. The name is underscore login status partial, which corresponds to the one that we just created over here. Okay, let's run this application and see what happens. Now you can see the logout link button over here because it sees we have a cookie. And when we click on this logout button, what happens is that there is a form over here. When you click on it, the submit button over here will be triggered and the entire form will be posted to the logout page. And when we go to the logout page, we can see that this method will be triggered and the sign out async will be triggered. The sign out async will look at the parameter and it knows which cookie to be killed. You can see that this cookie name corresponds to the scheme name. So therefore it will locate this cookie and get rid of this cookie. And by doing that, the user is logged out. So let's click on it and see whether it works or not. Okay, so it worked. Why do we see this page? That's because over here, once the sign out functionality is completed, the code redirects us to the index page, which is the home page. And remember, the home page is actually protected with the authorized attributes. So the authorization middleware kicks us to the login page. So now let's log in again just to make sure everything still works. So we logged in, we're seeing the home page, everything still works. Logged out again, we're seeing the login page. And as you have noticed that every time we click on the logout button, the cookie here is removed. And every time we log in, let's try to log in again, the cookie is added. Try log out again. You can see immediately the cookie is deleted. Because the cookie is deleted, we don't have the security context anymore. The user that is using the application is having the anonymous identity. Therefore, the application knows that the user is anonymous and kicks the user out to the login page. Okay, this is the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one. 2 videos ago, we have implemented simple authorization policies where we were simply checking the existence of a claim or specific values of claim. In this video, we are going to implement some more complicated scenarios where we're checking some custom logic other than just checking the presence of a claim or the specific value of the claim. So let's imagine a scenario where you are hired as a human resource manager, and you can access, of course, you can access human resource manager page, whereas the permission is only given when you pass your probation period, right? So for example, you have a 3 months probation period, and within the 3 months, although you're given the main claim and HR department claim, you still haven't passed your probation period, you won't be able to access the page, right? So that's going to be a custom requirement, which we're going to implement, and then we have to implement the authorization handler to help us to handle the requirement. And then in the handler, we can say whether the security context satisfies the requirement or not. Okay, so let's jump into Visual Studio and get started right away. First, let's go to the login page. And here, we're going to add another claim here. So new claim, and the name of the claim is going to be employment date. And the date, let's say 2025, May 1st. And then let's go to Solution Explorer here. And let's create a new folder. And let's call it Authorization. We're going to put all of our customer requirements under the Authorization folder. And for now, we only have one. So we're going to create a new class. And let's call it HR Manager Probation Requirement. And click on Add. Any custom requirement has to implement the Authorization Requirement interface, which is right here. If we go to the definition of this interface, you can see that it's actually empty. And the reason why it's empty, I can show you a little bit later. But for now, you just have to know that any custom requirement will have to implement this Authorization Requirement interface. After that, inside the class, the first thing we want to do is to create a constructor. And the parameter that is passed into the constructor is going to be the probation month. So we can use this to configure the requirement of probation period. So how long the probation period should be. So doing the control dot to create and assign a property. Okay, after that, we are going to create a requirement handler. And that requirement handler is going to handle this particular requirement. Therefore, we are going to copy the name of this requirement, and then we're going to create a new class. And we're just going to call it HR Manager Probation Requirement Handler. And for any handler, we'll need to derive from the authorization handler over here. And this here requires a generic type here. And you can see that this generic type is a authorization requirement. And that's the reason why we want our requirement to implement the authorization requirement here. So I'm going to copy this and paste it over here. And now you can see it has a red squiggly line. This is because this particular class is an abstract class. So I'm going to do a control dot to implement the abstract class. And automatically it generated this method here. It means that this method is overrated. And you can see that the requirement is passed in. Inside here, we just want to handle the requirement. Here, we want to get two things. We want to get the probation month, which we can get from the requirement. And secondly, we want to get the user information, right? The user claims that contains the employment date, so that we can compare the two things and see whether the probation period is satisfied or not. To get the employment date, you can see that we have this authorization handler context, and from within the context, we have this user property here. And from user, we can use the has claim to see whether we have the employment date claim, right? So we can say x goes to x dot type. So this is the key equals employment date. So I want to say that if user does not have the employment date, we are going to return task.completed task. This doesn't mean it succeeded, because if we want to succeed the requirement, we have to specifically use the succeed method, which we're going to use right after. So here, we need to get the employment date. And for that, again, we need to access the user property. And then I'm going to say find the first x goes to s2 first claim whose type is employment date. What we can do here is that we can use if datetime dot try parse, and we're going to parse the claim, which is this one. So this is the claim question mark dot value. And it's going to be an output parameter. It's going to output to a employment date, right? So if this succeeds, then we can continue with our logic. Otherwise, we're just going to return task.completed task.
And the logic here is that we first got the period, which is datetime dot now minus the employment date. And if the period dot days, you can see that this period is a time span, right? So if this is greater than 30 times requirement, which is this parameter, requirement dot probation months, which we configured over here. This is the property within the requirement. And then we're going to make it succeed. So we're going to say context.succeed. Which requirement are we succeeding? Is this requirement. Okay, so we have our requirement and we have our handler. The next step is to go to the program.cs. So control, comma, program.cs. Here, we need to register the requirement and the handler. We already have the HR manager policy here, and this HR manager policy is already being used on the HR manager page. You can go to the page model class here. You can see that this policy is already being used. All we have to do is to add the new requirement to it. So for that, we are going to chain this and we're going to say require. And here, instead of using require a particular requirement, we're just going to say requirements, and we're going to add a custom requirement, and that is our HR manager requirement. And we're going to pass in the probation month as 3. So you can put this in app settings. Here, I'm just going to hard code it here, and then I'm going to close it with a bracket. So now you can see this policy is amended. There is an and relationship between each one of these. So we added the new requirement. That means the person can access the HR manager only page only when the user belongs to the HR department and has to be a manager and also has to pass the probation period, which is 3 months. Another thing we need to do is we need to dependency inject the requirement handler. So for that, we're going to say builder.services.add singleton. You can use add transient. It doesn't really matter, but use singleton will improve the performance a little bit. So authorization handler, and it's going to be the HR manager probation requirement handler, and that's it. So we have our requirement added to the policy, and we registered our requirement handler. Before we give it a try, we want to add the HR manager page to the menu. And for that, we can go to the shared folder, go to the layout. Here, just above the privacy, we can add the HR manager page. So it's going to go to the HR manager page. So I'm going to copy this, go back to layout, and put it over here. And then I'm going to say HR manager. Again, coming back to this diagram, just so that we know exactly what's happening. So if we're trying to access this HR manager page, right, the authorization middleware will grab the policy name, and then it will go through all of the requirements and find their handlers, right? Because we have this handler specified to handle that specific requirement. The requirement is over here and the handler is over here. Therefore, the authorization middleware will be able to see this requirement and find its corresponding handler because we have this association right here, right? So this requirement is associated with this handler. So the authorization middleware will be able to know that this handler handles this requirement, and therefore it's going to execute this method. And then let's run the application and see what happens. We have our HR manager page here. If we click on it now, it just redirects to us to the login page. So I'm going to log in as admin password, click on login. Okay, now let's go to HR manager page. It says access denied. Why is that? Let's go to login page. This is where we generate the claim here. And you can see that the date is May 1st, 2025. And today's date is June 24th. So this is way less than 3 months. So maybe we can change the date to January 1st, and then we're going to run it again and see what happens now. So let's run the application, and let's click on the login button to regenerate the cookie.
So the cookie is now generated, and within the cookie, the new date is contained. So now if I go to HR Manager page, and you can see that I'm able to see the Human Resource Management page. Nothing changed on the page, it's just that our requirement changed. Right? We have this new requirement that is added, and the definition is contained within the custom requirement. So in this video, we have implemented this custom requirement and the custom requirement handler. So you can have pretty complicated requirement, and then all you have to do is just implement this authorization handler to handle the specific requirement. Okay, that's everything I want to cover in this video, and I'll see you in the next one. So once the login process finishes here, a cookie is generated as a authentication ticket. The cookie may or may not have a expiry date and time. As developers, we have the power to choose to set the expiry date and time or not. And that expiry date and time is also affected by browser session. So in this video, we are going to talk about the lifetime of a cookie and how it's affected by the browser session. Like I mentioned, as developer, we have the power to control the lifespan of the cookie. And the way to do so is to come to our program.cs file and find the cookie authentication handler, and our configuration is right inside here. So options.expire timespan, and then we can use timespan from minutes, from seconds, from hours. For testing purpose, let's use from seconds, and let's say 20 seconds. And then we can see how it affects the behavior of our application. So let's run the application. Okay, we're at our login page. We just log in and we are logged in. So if we watch the time here, 40, so let's wait for 20 seconds. Okay, 20 seconds has passed. So if I refresh the home page, you see I'm kicked out. And the reason why I'm kicked out is that the cookie has expired. So if we look at our cookie, it is here, but there is some information inside the cookie that specifies the expiry date of the cookie. So therefore, we're kicked out from the application. What happens if we close the browser before the cookie expires? Let's give that a test and see what happens. So instead of 20 seconds, I'm going to put 200 seconds. And then I'm going to run the application again. All right, so I'm going to log in. And now you can see that I have a cookie. And if I close the browser and open the browser again, you can see that our cookie is cleared, right? Although the cookie hasn't expired because 200 seconds hasn't passed yet. So how is browser session affects the lifetime of a cookie? So let's talk about that now. First of all, what is a browser session? Right? A browser session is basically an interaction between the browser and the server, right? So the browser session lasts as long as the lifetime of the browser. So as soon as you close the browser, the session is finished. So that's the browser session. So if we draw two bars, right, the first bar represents the lifetime of the cookie. The second one represents the lifetime of the session, browser session. So how is the browser session lifetime affects the cookie lifetime, right? So if the browser's lifetime is longer than the cookie lifetime, basically it does not affect the cookie's lifetime. The cookie will expire when the time comes, right? At this moment, it will expire. If the browser session is shorter than the cookie lifetime, of course, so the cookie's actual lifetime is right here, right? Because the browser is closed, the cookie is gone, right? But there is an exception where you as a developer can set the cookie as a persistent cookie, which means that the cookie will survive the browser's closing. Right? So even when the browser is closed, the cookie will still stay there. So this is called persistent cookie. Right? A persistent cookie will always have the lifetime as you set for the cookie. Let's say the browser is closed here, and then after sometime the browser is open again. This time the session is a little bit longer. The browser session is a bit longer. The cookie will still expire at this moment right there. So how do we set a cookie as a persistent cookie? You have all experienced the login screen where you see there's like keep me signed in or remember me checkbox. When you check that checkbox, then the cookie becomes a persistent cookie. Let's go ahead and implement that. So let's go to the login page here. First thing, we need a variable to receive that remember me setting. So it's going to be a property here in the credentials model, and the type is a boolean, so remember me. But we want to display that, so we need to have a better display name, and the name is going to be just remember me with a space. And then we're going to add this field in the front end. So go to login markup. We're going to copy this row and paste it above it. And over here, the form is for checkbox, so therefore we're going to use this class. And here we can change this input to a checkbox input. You can see that. And the class is going to be form-check-input. And we don't need a value here, but of course we need data binding. So this is for the credential dot remember me. Okay, after that we need a label for the checkbox. And the class for that is also form-check. The IntelliSense sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. And the data binding for that is, well, it's not data binding, but this label is for credential.rememberMe. And let's close this. Okay, so now we have this front end. And when user is input the value, it's going to be posted over here, right? And this variable is going to receive that. And we can get the value from the credentials object here. And the way to use that is to use that inside the sign-in async method, because it has a third parameter here. You can see that the signature has a third parameter where we can specify whether the cookie is a persistent cookie or not. Okay, so we're gonna have a variable defined here. So authentication properties, and it's going to be a new authentication properties. And in here we have this property, and we can assign credential.rememberMe to it. So when user is checking the remember me, we want to make the cookie a persistent cookie. A persistent cookie will survive the closing of the Blazor session. We can use the property as the third parameter. And when the sign-in async method is creating the cookie, it will check the authentication properties, and it will see whether the cookie is persistent or not, and it will create the cookie accordingly. So let's give that a try. And before we do that, let's go to program.cs. Let's confirm that we have a long-lived cookie, at least something that is enough for us to test. Let's run the application and give it a test. Okay, so now let's log in. And the first time, I'm not going to check the remember me. I'm going to just log in. And as you can see, we have this cookie over here. And remember, it's a 200 seconds lifespan cookie. So I'm going to just close the browser. And when I open it, I'm going to expect that I'm logged out because I did not check remember me. So run the application again. You can see that the cookie is deleted. So now let's try that again. But only this time, we will make it a persistent cookie by checking the remember me, clicking on login. So I'm logged in. And this time, let's close the browser. So this is well within 200 seconds. Close that and open it again by running the application again. So now you can see I'm not asked to log in. So this is the power of having a persistent cookie. That means the cookie is able to survive the closing of the browser session, and therefore he doesn't have to log in again. Okay, let's log out. Another thing I want to mention is that although the user checked the remember me checkbox, it does not mean that the cookie will always live.
it is still subject to the expiry time span setting over here. So let's make this 20 seconds and give it a test. So run the application and let's log in. And I'm going to check this, remember me, I'm going to log in and I'm going to start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to close this. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm going to run this again. 13, 14. You can see this still within 20 seconds. So I'm here. So now it's maybe 18, 19, 20. And now I'm going to refresh the page and I'm expect myself to be kicked out, right? Because as I said, the cookie, although it's persistent cookie, it's not going to survive expiry time span. So refresh and I'm out. Check the cookie here, it's deleted already.
So hopefully this video is helpful to help you understand the relationship between the cookie lifetime and browser session lifetime. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And if not, I'll see you in the next video.